Hi there. In our second part of the Diaspora of African Art, we're going to look at sort of second half of the 20th century coming into the 21st century. And we're going to look at some of the changes that have occurred as artists have moved from being outsider artists, artists who are literally untrained on the fringes of society, to artists who are highly educated and are part of kind of the mainstream art movement and how they come into that legacy. To begin with, a very seminal event that occurred in 1984 at the Museum of Modern Art, we see an exhibition called Primitivism, which examines modern art history of the early part of the 20th century and shows how much of the art of the early modernists were greatly inspired by African art and by other sort of traditional people all over the globe. And this show was a big success. People were, of course, really excited. They liked to see this modernist art by Picasso and other very famous artists from this time. And yet there was a huge backlash, and the backlash from the African American community was specifically very harsh. They were insulted that once again African art and the art of Africa is used as a kind of prop. It's used as a tool to explain American European art, but its own identity remains hidden, obscured. Its value, its significance is only in comparison to European traditions. It has no and is not given any intrinsic value or intrinsic respect. And so with this exhibition, there became a kind of big soul searching in the artistic community about the way African art is understood, African art is presented, and the kind of commentary and who does the commentary about African art. All of these issues really started to come into focus in the early 80s and became a part of the sort of ongoing battles, which we call now the culture wars in America, where who gets to talk for whom and how. And this is what continues on even today. An artist who emerges at this time is none other than Jean-Michel Basquiat, who's a rather curious New York artist who, though he has artistic training, lives is a street on the streets of New York as a homeless man who's kind of wandering around, collecting art supplies, making things from scraps he finds, graffiti art, spray painting things on walls. And from this rather fringes of the art making world, he's one of the first who really is successfully launched a major art career. He's the first African American to actually get to become an art star, an artist whose work is collected and bought and purchased by the most expensive galleries all over the world. Jean-Michel Basquiat never even seemed to have a bank account. He had in his apartment, it is said, large sums of money stuffed into books and into cups and drawers, and he didn't seem to know what to do with it all. He had a problem with drug addiction, and he was sort of running around in this kind of manic way, as his paintings sort of attest to the sort of crazy, jubilant, wild, alternative world that he was a part of, this street world, the kind of crazy art-making world of New York. And so his work is really about that kind of jazz, that kind of noise and tumult that was a part of street art, graffiti art, that he sort of capitalized on and became the name. I went to a retrospective of Jean-Michel Basquiat's work at the Gagosian Gallery in New York, and it was huge, and the place was packed. And it was full of people who were clearly deeply, deeply moved and connected to, they saw Jean-Michel Basquiat as their hero, as a man who really represented, really spoke to the street life of New York. Not the art of the elite, but the art of the people, the downtrodden, and this kind of chaotic handwriting, doodling, masses and stuff that he made were really a part and parcel of this kind of chaotic world that he inhabited. Here in one of his last works before he died of drug overdose at a very young age, he shows himself in his very sort of personal narrative. A lot of his paintings were very autobiographical, and he sees writing with death. He feels that he is being carried along by this kind of death creature that is sort of leading him into oblivion that he seems unable to steer or control. Basquiat created a kind of new opening for artists who were not of the mainstream, and they sort of expanded and opened the net to a much broader array of artists, especially African American artists, who began to try and tap into their artistic legacy and their unique voices. Rene Stout here created a life-size cast of her own body, calling it Fetish as a kind of the name. Remember the Nkisi Nkande with the mirrored eyes and the packet of medicines on the belly. And here she's showing how her own body has become a part of this sort of fetishization of sort of the way in which African American women are represented, are commodified, are put into these roles. And so this is a part of her own sort of, again, personal narrative and a way of kind of trying to realize a unique artistic voice that pushes back against the prevailing narratives of objectification. Another artist who has worked a great deal with, the representation of African Americans and popular culture in a kind of retro way, harkening back to the silhouettes of the Civil War and later. This is Carl Walker, who uses the silhouette in a kind of surrealist way to provoke a kind of disturbing idea of narrative and of what's happening here, kind of questioning who is and where what things are as they kind of bleed into each other. Carl Walker creates this kind of powerful space with her extraordinary complex silhouettes that play on this idea of identity, role. What do we know about a person when we see just the silhouette? What does it say about them? What details do we pick up on? How do we read and understand these enigmatic images? Another artist who is really fascinated in sort of pop culture and iconography is Wangechi Muchu, who does a kind of collage. Like Romare Bearden, her collages are a part of a kind of patchwork of images and icons. But they're sort of fed into a much more sort of sensuous, seductive way. This is really looking at the woman's point of view of sexuality and identity and the things that make up sexuality and identity. You can see here, writing death in my sleep, the way that she sort of uses collaged lips and eyes and sort of melds them with watercolor to create these kind of vibrant, intense, surreal worlds. Here is another by Wangechi Muchu, The Family Tree, where again the figure is distorted. And what is this tree? How is it grown? What are the elements of her identity? Perhaps one of the most famous African-American artists today is Kehinde Wiley, who is really sort of burst on the scene with some really spectacular, monumental paintings, reimagining classic paintings by Velázquez and by the great realist painters of the Romantic and Neoclassical period. And Kehinde Wiley reconfigures them with African Americans sort of acting out these roles in which they are once both hip-hop artists and Etruscan portraits of great Count Olivares. And this sort of way in which they seem to be kind of play acting, not quite doing the part, asking us to imagine what if, what would this be like? And then he fills the frame, instead of a kind of verisimilitude, he sort of fills the whole frame with, instead of a lush background, he kind of flattens the whole space with this rich, ornate, gilded world that's sort of teeming with life and energy. Here is another one of his paintings after Sir Joshua Reynolds, the portrait of Dr. Samuel Johnson. And here, again, another hip-hop artist is brought into the fore, where he is assuming the role of a European. And what does that role mean? And why is he doing this? Is this success? Is this what it means to be a celebrity? To have a portrait painted in this grand manner? So there's a lot of interesting questions about identity. He sort of turns the whole question of who is this person? What are they in this role? What is this role to them? In a very interesting way. And I want to show you a whole page of different composites where you can see both the final portrait on the left and the actual original portrait from the European past. And you can see how he's sort of fusing these together in really fascinating ways. Very compelling, very dramatic, with, again, a touch of humor. I went to see an exhibition of Kehinde Wiley's work and a number of African-American artists in Washington, D.C. at the Cochrane Museum. And I was very fortunate to see this painting here. I see the size of this here. This is 132 inches tall by 300 inches long. This is a vast, vast canvas. It takes up this enormous room, this huge, sweeping, elegant, beautiful canvas. It's just incredible to see the incredible power and grandeur of the figure laid out here. And it's, again, based by Jean-Bernard Rissalt's Sleep. And it creates this very elegant and powerful portrait in this repose. Kaindi Wylie, as I said, is probably one of the most famous African-American artists today, and he was honored with the commission to paint the official portrait of Barack Obama is now hanging in the portrait gallery alongside all the presidential portraits. And of course, because it's Kehinde Wiley and because it's Barack Obama, this was quite a celebrity event just a few months ago when this was unveiled for the first time. It's a very interesting portrait. Like a lot of Kehinde Wiley's, it shows him sort of floating in a very lush green background with sparkles of flowers sort of blooming. And it says once celebratory and also fertile and abundant. And he looks so serious with just this faintest trace of a smile. His cuffs are lined up in front of him to create a kind of flatness, almost like he's locked in arms there. And he seems, this elegant chair, which seems it would be right at home in a presidential suite, is where he is here, casual, no tie, and yet present, firmly looking at us, firmly assessing who we are. The flowers in the background are quite interesting. There is the blue lilies of Kenya, the jasmine for Hawaii, and the chrysanthemums for Chicago. And he puts these all together to talk about the sort of the tapestry that is Barack Obama's life, that makes him such an interesting and compelling person. Another very important African-American artist today is Nick Cave, who had gained his fame in the early 90s and late 80s with his sound suits. And he made them initially to be worn to make sound. And he just liked this idea of something that was like celebratory, like a Mardi Gras parade, where this sort of outrageous riot of objects overwhelms the figure and makes this incredible noise as they are moved, danced in a very compelling way. So Nick Cave's sound suits, I have a link to a video. You can see his work in action. It's really quite extraordinary. Just last year, I was in the Museum of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and there I saw this exhibition, Nick Cave's Property, from 2014. Here Nick Cave has created a series of found objects. Most of his work, he doesn't actually sort of make individual things. He's actually sort of assembling large quantities of found objects, things from, curio shops and what have you, and he sort of assembled them. Here, this idea of property, we see this African-American figure on a stool, and he's sort of set up like he is on display. Is he for sale? All these objects, are they his, or are they a part of who he is? This background, this strange tumult of activity behind him, is this his past? Is he emerging out of the kind of cosmic background like a Benin soldier? And this is a really fascinating piece, the way it touches into the idea of what makes a person and what objects compose our identity, what kind of things can be there to express who we are and what defines us. Martin Puryear is really a very extraordinary artist who has a long history and is a tremendous craftsman. I can't possibly begin to show you all of his work. I have a link to a wonderful talk he gives where he talks about his work and his exploration, and I highly recommend you kind of look into him further. He's just a really tremendous artist, incredible craftsman, and someone who really takes great care in forming what he's doing. He was raised in in the United States, but during the civil rights protests, he did not stay in the United States. First, he was in Africa, working in the to support a small village. He was learning about the craftsmanship, the way they made things in Africa. He was really fascinated to help people in their village. So this was part of his early training. He did a lot of drawing about the sort of material life of people in Africa. And following that, he goes on to Sweden, and there he works with boat builders, and he starts to really learn fine woodworking, the kind of skills and crafts that will carry on through the rest of his life. And he uses this idea of the construction and the forms finely crafted. There's a kind of utility to his work. It seems to have a kind of purpose or real material function. And that's where a lot of his ideas are sort of register. Here's a very interesting piece by Martin Puryear. the Phrygian. This hat was the hat of the during the slavery was abolished in France. This hat was a part of liberty and a part of the rise of the proletariat in France in the French Revolution. This was the hat that you wore to overthrow the monarchy. And so African Americans were freed in France initially, and then during the French Revolution, and then during the Napoleon comes to power and he throws them back into slavery, and it's just really brutal. It's only, again, later after Napoleon is conquered that they regained their rights. But this kind of image, this hat, is something that he found initially sort of really attracted to him, his time in Europe. And then only later did he discover that it was also indeed a kind of hat, a kind of unity that African Americans had with the rebellion in the French Revolution.